Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Senior Vice President, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation, Mark DeCourcy.
Thank you, everyone, and good morning. Extra points to all of you who are here on time this morning. We're expecting a full house throughout the course of the day, so make sure that you have your seats saved for yourself, and we will continue to fill people in as they arrive. Again, I'm Mark DeCourcy. I'm the Senior Vice President of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation, and I have the privilege of leading the Corporate Citizenship Center. Welcome to our conference. This year's conference, Opportunity Forward, will explore the ways the business community, together with their partners, many of you are here, taking action and creating solutions that build greater opportunities and prosperity for all. At the most basic level, businesses are problem solvers. From providing invaluable services to innovating new products, the private sector, by design, finds opportunity and also drives solutions. So it only makes sense that lending and leading businesses are turning their problem-solving abilities to the greatest social issues of our time. From food security to disaster relief, businesses are taking problems we face head-on to create a stronger future for all of us. Our mission with this year's conference is to provide you with real-world examples and practical suggestions that can challenge, inform, and improve your organization's corporate citizenship initiatives. We'll have deep dive sessions throughout the conference on how to improve the effectiveness of your health and wellness, economic empowerment, sustainability and circular economy, disaster response, food security, education, and other corporate citizenship programming. We'll also have opportunities for you to join the conversation on social media. So throughout the conference, we'll be live tweeting. You can follow the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag USCCF Opportunity, and our Twitter handle is USCCF Biz for Good. So that's USCCF Biz, B-I-Z, the number 4, good. We also have an app for the conference that includes the agenda, speaker bios, attendee list, and other networking capabilities. Similar to last year, the speaker Q&A will also run through the app. To download, search for the U.S. Chamber Foundation in the App Store. And once you have the app, you can download the Opportunity Forward Guide. If you have any trouble, our Chamber Foundation staff would, of course, be glad to help you out. And if you're wondering who they are, I've decided to tell you at the beginning of the conference instead of waiting until the end when we thank them for all their hard work. So if you flip your program books that you have in front of you to the last page, you'll see all of us, so you know what we look like. And I'd also like our staff to stand up and raise your hand. So, well, that's not everyone, but it's almost everyone. The rest of them are out front getting people to come in and register. I'd also like to thank our sponsors who make this conference possible. The Dow Chemical Company, DSM, FedEx, the Gill Foundation, MGM, PNC, Viacom, America's Charities, JP Morgan Chase, Global Impact, EY, the UN Foundation, and Nothing But Nets. We also need to thank the sponsor of this year's Tech Corner, Comcast NBC Universal. If you need to recharge a device or answer a few work emails, head up the stairs in the back, right there, to Tech Corner. There you can have meetings, if you'd be quiet, and also recharge your devices. So now I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Valerie Keller. She's the Executive Director of Global Markets at Ernst & Young and the founder and global leader of EY's Beacon Institute. The Beacon Institute is a community of business leaders, board members, and academics focused on helping organizations create long-term value and navigate the disruptive forces shaping the 21st century. We could not ask for a more fitting expert to lead us into our time together over the next few days, so please join me in welcoming Valerie Keller.
You know, I don't believe there's something called social entrepreneurship. There's only entrepreneurship, and the imperative of us putting our work towards changing society. Corporate social purpose is a reality of what we as entrepreneurs must deliver in order for us to have the proper world for our children, for future generations.
Purpose sits at the heart of everything we do.
Businesses today
are the organizations that have that ability to effect the change around us.
It's not just about having a purpose. It's how well it's integrated and lived in the day-to-day of organizations.
It's just good business. Millennials, even Generation Xers and others, they only want to work for companies that have authentic purpose embedded in their DNA.
Show me your covenant with customers that doesn't depend on the quarter's numbers, but depends on the long-term investment that you're going to be making.
Having quantitative metrics that really make it hard-nosed, specific, and allow you to link environmental or social impact to the growth of the organization is absolutely key.
We have a huge responsibility, and it's about time we stepped up to it.
We think there's a new idea of what it means to be a business in the world, and maybe an idea whose time has come. Good morning. Thank you. I haven't even said anything yet, but it was a great video, right? And I think it's great to applaud for the great work that's being done as well. It's a privilege to start the day with you this morning. Thank you for showing up and bringing yourself together and to kind of clump together in this a great tribe of people. When I got this invitation to come, and I actually got it, and I had to come via Helsinki, basically, because I was speaking over there about these conversations and topics. And I looked actually at the list of who would be here, and I was like, okay, I'm in. Because these are the people who are getting up every day, who are thinking about what does it mean to be a better world and a better business and a better world. And so if we and I can help to inspire and equip you to be more of you, that's why we're here today. So thank you for that opportunity to do so. We're going to spend just a few minutes together, and I'd love to share basically some takeaways that could be helpful for you in the space that you're in. But this is the beginning of a dialogue and a conversation over the next 2 days as well. So the first thing that I would say is not going to be a surprise, but the idea that there is a movement underway. And what do we mean by that? At some levels, you know this because you've been part of catalyzing a movement on purpose and business. And really the intention around moving from the margins to the mainstream, and that the work that many people in this space have been doing has been often on the fringe or on the margin. And what we see is an escalation and a movement and a paradigm shift about what is the possibility of what it means to be a business and a human being in the world today. And Beacon came about as a representation of that. So I'll tell a little bit about the story of that because I think it's also part of your journey and what is useful for you. But well, it all started with a dark and stormy night, like good stories do, right? But I met the chairman of EY at the Tata Nightcap in Davos, and he said, what do you do? And I said, purpose-driven transformation, because that's what we're up to. And I was a CEO of social enterprises in the background and had been teaching leadership at Oxford and was actually looking at saying, gosh, there's something there, but it's, again, this question of like, how does it move forward? How do we move from kind of the nice to have to necessary? And Mark Weinberger, our chairman and CEO, said, purpose-driven transformation. Well, we're doing that. Come and talk to us. And what he meant by we're doing that was EY, as a big global corporation, had taken on a purpose of building a better working world. And we were in an inquiry of saying, well, what does that mean? If you put that at the heart of your business, how does that change your business? What do you do? So Beacon came about from literally going through saying, what could our gift be to those of you who are on the leading edge of this conversation, the C-suite of the big global corporations and the medium-sized companies that said, what can put this at the heart? And so we went around and did what a lot of we do. We broke bread together and had fine wine. We crowdsourced the name, and we said, if we could provide something, what's needed next to help to galvanize the movement? And I like alliteration, so we heard three things. We heard we need the stats, the business case, we need the stories of who's doing what, and we need safe space to be able to have honest conversations about what works, what doesn't, where do we get in our own way, what stops us. So today, I'll share a little bit about some of the stats, and I'll share a little bit about, we're in safe space, and a little bit of the stories there. We're going to hear stories over the next couple of days together, next 2 days, and you live your own story. So we won't focus as much on those in the short time that we have. But I wanted to share with you a little bit of the data, the business case that's there, although, as we also know, that's not ultimately what moves hearts and minds. It's just more data, more powder, gunpowder in your pocket there. So but let's think about why this is happening. Let's put a broader context over this. And I'll tell you that my own journey at this is actually just, it's a fundamental human thing. Like, what do we mean by kind of like, what's the game that we're playing? And for so often, both at individual levels, but at organizational levels, the game we've been playing is let's go for money, right? So let's go for money. And this new dimension that we have as an opportunity is this dimension of meaning, right? And that's where purpose falls. That's where sustainability and impact falls. It's that dimension and that depth of the dimension in there. Or another way to think about it is we've been going for finance, right? And we've gotten really good at that. Businesses have been really great at making money, providing for jobs, growing economies in that way. But there's another dimension there of fulfillment, right? I told you I like alliteration. So what's the next one? We've been going for productivity, right? And the more, right? And the opportunity for us as humans, if our short little time on the planet, is to go for purpose. And I came into this actually, so a bit of a crazy background piece on this, but I was born into a Christian cult in the cornfields of Indiana, and then finished up in the Southern Baptist Bible Belt of Louisiana. So I was raised with this kind of notion of saying there's something more, there's more in meaning. And I had this other kind of epiphany, even after I had left the cult mindset. If you want to know more about that, it'll take you cocktails. You have to buy me on that. But one thing I did think is I had this epiphany that many of you have already had, because you're way smarter than me, and my development was a little slow on this, because we were thinking about the hereafter and now instead of the here, was life is short and I am going to die. Like, I'm going to die one day. And so there was that kind of saying, like, well, if that's the case, then what am I going to do with it? Am I just going to like wander around, do more of that other stuff? Or is there the opportunity to go for meaning and fulfillment and make it fun, make it matter? Like, what's the game that we're playing and how do we play it? And we spend so much of our time in work, we spend so much of our time in businesses, and people are starving for the opportunity for it to matter, because I'm not the only one. We're all going to die, right? So let's make it count. And part of that is the conversation that leads into the context of what do we mean by purpose? And where are we seeing that businesses, that if we go on these multiple dimensions, that we have the opportunity for sustainable growth. In today's context, and I don't have time to get into the conversation about why the context has changed, but we'll talk about it a little bit. First of all, let's just spend a couple of seconds on what is purpose, the why of this. Many of you have seen the golden circle. We have this conversation. It's one of these things that says if you try and put some definition around it, it starts to lose its resonance and its meaning. But at some level, we kind of get it. We would say it's an aspirational reason for being that calls forth the humanity. It's generally long-term. It's generally outward-facing. We would not call, in some cases, short-term profitability purpose, although in many cases, the purpose of business has been that. But why does it matter? And I think this is an interesting point about why it matters more today and why your work matters more today is because business leaders around the world that we've talked to globally, and they held constant no matter the geography, the industry, the company size, were saying that their purpose is almost completely changed, more than 66%, because of the disruptive environment. And as we know, the only thing that's certain is change. And more than 73% are saying that a well-integrated purpose helps them to navigate. So why of the why has changed. It's not because thou shalt do good or don't do bad. It's because actually it's becoming an enabling environment that's forcing companies to think about it and providing them the capabilities to go. But not all purpose is created equal. And when we asked executives and we said, kind of, where are you falling on the purpose? Like, what does purpose mean to you? So the first time that we did some research with Harvard Business Review, we kind of gave this definition of purpose that I gave and said, okay, where do you fall in that spectrum? Generally something that would fall in. And the next time we asked him, we said, what is the purpose of your business? And I think this is very interesting in its findings because, as you can see, more than 60% are still defining purpose based on the kind of stakeholder view of it. But surprisingly for us, 40% are defining it in a broader, more human-centric, societally engaged view. And interestingly here, the direction of travel is clear. So when we said, where is it today? Now granted, this wasn't the question of saying, how well do you live it? Hold that thought, right? This is what is your organization's reason for being? What is the organizing principle that's guiding your strategy? So the interesting part there is that if we said, where are you going? The direction of travel says that more than 50% of organizations are moving here. And the reason why I really want to share this with you is because if many of you are making the case, there is a bit of a case that says we don't want to be left behind. Other people are getting this. And we can talk about why they're getting it. Is it part of the whole technology that's raising this question of disruption and jobs, and what does it mean to be human? Is it about attracting workers in the gig economy, et cetera, et cetera? What the elements that are behind this that you can look at in other places say that the direction of travel is clear. So I'm going to fly through the why here because I'm going to make a big assumption that you guys know this already. But I think in a point just to say, the data is clear, the evidence base is there that says that from a consumer brand perspective, from attraction and retention of talent, because if the environment is always changing, if the only thing that's certain is change, then the ability to keep your best people who have the most options becomes a key capability. Talentism is the new capitalism. I remember that was a buzzword at one point. So the ability to keep people and take them on a journey, and then of course Raj Sisodia's work there. The interesting other piece here is that a conversation around purpose and impact and meaning, as it's related to transformation and innovation, has started to shift the conversation. So again, the conversation we've been having is at the core of the C-suite of where the decisions are made, where the money hits the road, put your money where your mouth is, how are organizations living this? So this notion that we looked at, and this came from a review that we did with Harvard Business Review, is to say that organizations that are truly purposeful companies are able to innovate in times of disruption and drive transformational change. And I think DSM is here in the room, one of the sponsors. We're looking and doing a case study with them. Their CEO, their head of innovation, their chief financial officer, they would line up behind this and say, this has helped to change. When I was a CEO of Social Enterprise, and we completely, radically changed our business model and was able to attract and retain talent and pull them through, completely changed the businesses that we were in because there was this purpose that we were connected to that made us less precious about what we were doing because it was about the how that we would kind of get there. You heard from Murad in the opening video, and I think this is neat because this goes to the point that we're making about from the margins to the mainstream. So this is not to toot the horn of EY in any way, but we do this World Entrepreneur of the Year event. That's really pretty cool, and some of you may have gone. And what I thought was so fascinating is that this year's winner stands up there and says essentially this. And he didn't win because there was some kind of criteria that said thou shalt be purpose-driven in that way, but he stood up and he told a crowd of people that included finalists like Marriott founders and everybody from all around the world, each countries, and he said very unequivocally that this is the method for business. And from an entrepreneur's perspective, in order to grow and in order to enter the new markets, and you can see his own growth story clearly there, and what he did in a very, very short period of time. And what they were doing was saying, we exist to bring sustainable protein to the world. So they're the world's largest vertically integrated supply chain of beans and legumes. And this business based in Canada showing up and representing, and I thought, it's the mainstream. I was sitting there like with my hands like this, touchdown, right in the middle of that. We've moved that conversation. And I think, again, the data backs that up as well in the growth and expansion. But interestingly, so here's the question for us now. If that's so great and good, how do we do it? And I chose this image on purpose because there's a lot of conversation around purpose, and it's all good that we've got this kind of zeitgeist about it, and is it a new evolution of kind of the words around sustainability or impact, or is it actually fundamentally rethinking the core purpose of business today? But one of the things, and one of the honest critiques, is that it's kind of a lot of purpose puffery. So how do we have something that's not a tagline and we just change the coffee cups and it's the screensaver that pops up and actually have something that's the organizing principle, the new way to be and live in business on that? How do we move from rhetoric to reality? And a lot of these conversations start honestly and helpfully in the marketing or PR department, or maybe in the sustainability space, or maybe it's a talent piece. But how do we move beyond CSR, PR, HR, into saying that this is the real way that businesses are living today? Because this is an honest critique in many organizations as well. But it's also a journey. When you take a stand, what do you go for? So what stops us? The way to think about how to move forward, when I'm kind of saying, okay, well, can you look at what the barriers are? What stops us? If purpose is so great and so good, and we all want to live lives of meaning and fulfillment, and let's go for that, and it gives us sustainable growth in this new environment, because we can attract people and connect with them, what stops us? And so we did a survey with Harvard Business Review as well. We looked at this, and what leading executives said, and again, the participants in this are people in the mainstream business who are running P&Ls of organizations and the top leaderships. And I don't know if there's anything surprising here. Like, I think if we were to actually kind of write this down and crowdsource this ourselves, I think we probably would say, yeah, it's the short-term financial pressures, particularly, the system out there of the shareholders, publicly traded companies, but even in privately held organizations. It's this gap between say and do. We kind of say it, but we don't walk it. And what does walk it mean? The idea that compensation is not linked to it. We measure what we treasure. So I'm saying that I'm supposed to be going for this great, better wellness, goodness, kind of serve humanity thing in my business, but actually I'm measured on time, utilization, sales, and my sales doesn't have anything to do whether or not it's actually serving the customer in this other way, whether it's actually providing that impact that we say we want to stand for. The lack of leadership conviction, I tend to not want to over-rotate on this so we don't have more of the cult of the CEO hero. There I go with cults again. But there is something there about saying, does the leadership really get it at their core, and do they model it in the behaviors that they make? And this idea of the wrong KPIs is an important one. And it goes back to measure what we treasure. When we talk to so many people today in the business, kind of say the middle, the marzipan layer, so the top kind of gets it, the bottom's fired up, and then there's this kind of sticky bit in the middle. And people say, well, why is that? And when we ask them, they say, because I feel, again, alliteration alert, sorry, my kind of consolidation on that, I'm stuck in the matrix, the metrics, and the margin. And that's the reality. So we can say that we're going for this other thing, but I'm stuck in this spider web, if you will, a very neatly constructed one of the matrix, the metrics, and the margins. So how do we change that? How do we see our role as systems transformers in that way? And what we also looked at, too, is saying, okay, going for capital P purpose, this idea of redefining what it means to be a successful business in the today, capital P as that broader ambition of outward-facing, serving, socially ambitious, et cetera, versus small p of profits. So going for that, but not actually integrating it, opens you up to risk. So this came from research that we did, again, with 1,500 global executives almost around the world, that said, if you are talking but not walking, you move down into putting value at risk. And that makes sense, right? Because you've now put out an ambition. You have a stand that you've taken, and now you could potentially be dinged on it. And we hear this from some people when I would say, oh, we want to feature you as beacons of 21st century business. And they'd be like, we kind of need another year or two to get down the road because, yeah. Another thing I took away from my childhood there as well is saying the only people who can be hypocrites are good Christians, right? So other than that, the heathens, you can do anything you want. But if you take a stand and you say you're going for something, then it creates a bit of a gap. So the challenge to us doesn't mean that we don't stand for anything. It doesn't mean that we don't go for it. It just means that we've got to integrate. We've got to align, and we've got to make it real, particularly in the transformation age that we're in, where it's digital and it's always on, where there's a democratization of the corporation and your employees own your brand on things like Glassdoor and your customers own your brands on social media as well. So this alignment becomes incredibly important. And I wanted to end on a story with Unilever because I think the interesting point here is about saying that it is a journey. It's a journey that we go on as organizations, and looking and learning from someone who I would call very much a beacon on the front end of this. And part of the inquiry that we've been in is saying, how do you move beyond kind of the Paul Pullmans of the world, et cetera? And I should have said this earlier, but when we launched Beacon, we launched it with Paul Pullman, Richard Branson, Arianna Huffington, the CEO of Barclays, CEO of Mondelez, and more than 120 people who got up on a very cold Davos morning, and this is unheard of to have this many people kind of crowd in for a breakfast there, to launch this concept of saying, let's redefine what it means to be a successful business. But part of what we were saying there, even a couple of years ago, was how do we have more beacons and how do we learn from those who have been on the front end? And I think the interesting thing that we would say about the Unilever story has been taking the stand, making sure that it's been something that the Sustainable Living Plan, so this idea of making sustainable living commonplace, setting out a goal, X by Y, and I know some of you will do that later. We were talking about it with Kroger back in the green room. There'll be other stories in that way. But the idea of also being able to crowdsource innovation, to open it up, for them to create an open innovation platform that says when we move from we sell soap to we give a child a chance to live past the age of 5, and we're going to have integrity about that, and we're going to look at all of our brands, and we're going to distribute from our portfolio what doesn't seem to fit, and we're going to look at individual level of what does it mean for your purpose as an individual, et cetera. And I think, many people, I think, held their breath when the Kraft merger the play was out there. And Paul believes, and many people in the organization believe, and I think there's great evidence support to this as well, that the resilience that allowed them to fight that off in a very short period of time was because there was such a fundamental difference in the culture and the ethos and what that organization was going for, and that they've essentially helped turn their brand into a movement. So that provided a resiliency. And the reason why I mentioned that is because, again, that's kind of a why of a lot of the existing C-suite, of how do I prevent the activist shareholder from coming in, the short-term profitability, et cetera. And I think that the Unilever story actually provides a bit of an example of saying there's resiliency there, if you look at walking the talk. So let's talk just for a few minutes about the idea of what is a journey. What does that mean? And I'll just kind of take a couple of minutes more to say that this, in many ways, there's no right or wrong any way to do this. We're all making it up as we go, right? And many of you have been making it up as you've gone as pioneers in this work for many years that you've been doing. But there's something that we would say that is about taking a stand initially, that we create in language, that we get to say who we are as people, we get to say who we are as a business. And this language of we take a stand, I think, is an interesting one. I remember opening up the pages of the New York Times not too long ago, and I think the conversation around Uber has been interesting as a transformation, and they're definitely in their own space of having huge growth and now having to say, actually, how do we reorient for purpose? And the CEO was with us at our MoMA event recently in New York, and was having this kind of, intentional conversation. But then you had Lyft coming in as a competitor, running a full-page ad saying, with us, when you ride with us, when you take a seat, you take a stand, right? And this idea then of saying we stand for something and that people expect us to stand for something. One of the things that we would say is that you actually, as a CEO or your leadership team, whether or not you wake up and you come to events like this and you think about this every day, your customers and your employees expect you to be a capital P business in many cases, whether you know it or not. The world has changed. The environment has changed in that way. So this alignment, this ability, it says people expect companies to stand for something. And I would say we could have a whole conversation about the need to stand for something, given where our world is today, given what the kind of the polarization and that we see in politics globally at the national levels, given what we see in terms of just the inability, and often many cases of the NGO sector, to be able to help in and solve for problems, that creates a gap and a space that says business has an incredible role, an incredible opportunity to play, and the expectation is that we will do it. And not do it in a way that's don't do bad shit. Like just clean up your supply chain, like make sure your people get a living wage, but actually stand for and embed. So a couple of thoughts. The idea that what we've seen from beacons on the leading edge of this journey, what does it mean to be a beacon of business in the 21st century? How do we redefine success for ourselves? It's this concept of taking trajectory decisions. So I boil it down to say that we get to rewrite the rules of the game. And I think so much we feel like the systems that we're in and the rules of the game that we're playing by are fixed and they're hard, and this is the way it is, and it's a hard slog, et cetera. And I think unpacking that just a little bit and say, you know what, we made this up. We made up money as an idea. It's trust, it's based on trust and honesty. We made up money. We made up business equals profits, short term, We made up this is how you organize, et cetera, et cetera. The freedom behind that is to say if we made it up that way and it served us really well on one dimension, then what can we do to make it up the other way? And what do we have as an opportunity for our time, our short time on the planet, to help rewrite the rules of the game? And to show people that it's a fun game that we can be playing. And it's very important. I think sometimes we can overcomplicate things. We want to make it a giant transformation program for the whole organization, the whole world. And we can say, okay, well, we can boil it down and say, time. Where do you spend your time, and where do you spend your money? I mean, ultimately, that's all we have is our time and how we organize and how we clump together. Because ultimately, organizations are comprised of organisms. It's us. It's the people. Right? So how do you spend your time and your money? And the business thinks about this all day. So where does the core business spend the time and money? What are the symbolic sacrifices? So this is another piece that I think is really interesting. Sometimes purpose is revealed in what you don't do as much as what you do. How many in here remember the CVS moment? I get a show of hands, CVS? It's interesting, right? A company, CVS, you know the company, it's a long time kind of retail outlet store, et cetera, that said, okay, we took a stand for CVS Health, we're rebranding. So we went through a rebranding exercise. We have said that actually we looked at the future demographics, so it's a strategy conversation as well. Future demographics of what is the population going, what are the demands going to be, what's needed. Okay, we're going to go for health. Kind of have a problem because we kind of sell cigarettes. Slightly inconvenient. And I know people have been on this, and so that was not an easy decision for people to take. That was a $2 billion revenue loss that you're originally taking. But the interesting thing about the CVS story is it made it clear. I didn't know CVS was thinking about this. I didn't know they were looking at that on a journey. When they stood out and said, we're not doing this anymore because we're taking a stand, and actually the way that we spend time and money and the products and services that we sell are inconsistent with that. What that allowed them to do, of course, is to move into minute clinics and the idea that you can now do different kinds of pharmacy and healthcare provision, et cetera. So you could say, ultimately, and their numbers in terms of seeing growth of 10% over the prior year quarters, et cetera, back that up. But you could just say, God, that was a really smart strategic move. And I'd say, yeah, okay, good, right? Good. But there was something about symbolic sacrifices. And I think this next point, I'm saying, what is the business model for a model business? So how are we organized in that way? Again, if organizations are organisms and we can kind of clump together in that way, what is the business model for a model business? And I know we've got a breakout session with Gerard later on this afternoon that's looking at the fourth sector as a space of that. But if you're also looking at kind of mainstream corporations, thinking about, are they more flat? Are they more open? Is there something that's allowing people to kind of saying, if you're dealing with the purpose, you're there? One of the things that we also see is that purpose is often made real at the geographic regional level. So I remember coming in and doing a keynote in Africa for a telco company, and the C-suite was having a whole bunch of political issues and strategy issues, et cetera, et cetera. And when I'm having this conversation around purpose, the regional leaders of Turkey, the regional leaders of Armenia, the regional leaders of other were like, yeah, we get it, because this is how this translates for us in the region level. And I think that's an interesting piece. Well, look at this last question. I think this is kind of a buzzword, but I think it makes sense in terms of the idea of saying, how do we go from ego to eco? And there's a way to unpack that in a couple of different ways. I think one of the things I would encourage us to think about, given the space that many of you hold, the jobs that you're in the organization, of saying, how do you make it everybody's job? Or if it's not everybody's job, it's the business leader's job to own what you're doing. So in many cases, you can see an evolution that says, you know, if you're on this journey of saying, okay, we stand for something, so we're going to make our money over here, and then we're going to give some things away philanthropically, or, okay, we're going to do this, but then we're going to create the sustainability department, Okay, we're going to do this. And I've seen this move at sometimes that some organizations are saying that by virtue of having that, it makes it somebody else's job. And I know in Unilever and other organizations, they're looking at saying, we're not going to have sustainability departments. Some organizations are saying we're not going to have a foundation or a philanthropy piece because if we do that, it confuses this other piece. EY is different in that way. We have very much social engaged programs that are standing for driving economic inclusion. We've got foundations, et cetera, but we're also looking at the core piece of the business. And I think it's an interesting question for us to take on that says, can we sometimes get out of our own way? And that by very virtue of our existence, and it's our turf and it's our thing to help make the business move in this way, do we sometimes keep others from really owning it? So is there an opportunity to think of ourselves as systems transformers, as ways to help redefine what success means? That says you don't think about embedding your strategy or activating your strategy. You kind of live your strategy. So if it's the same thing from a purpose perspective, or whatever that nomenclature is that you want to use about it, is how do you live this in the day-to-day of the organization so that the metrics of meaning, that the metrics of the organization are defined and they're owned by the CFO. That's who's accountable for being able to see, do we measure what we treasure? The business leaders are the ones that are accountable for saying, are we executing on the strategy? And our strategy is in support of our purpose. So do we own that? Do we live that? So that's the opportunity that I would give for us today. So I think the incredible place that we have right now is to say, how do we translate this zeitgeist of purpose, which is wonderful. The fact that people are talking about this and that they want it and that it matters, and in some cases what's been happening in the other world around us, which seems so much doom and gloom, has created an opportunity for people to say, actually, we want people to stand for something. We want to make it matter more. What happens in this space? So that's the opportunity that we have, that each of us have, to make it count in our own lives, in our own ways, to help to think about how do we create the model business for an idea whose time has come. And I look around the room here today, and I think you are representative of what we even crowdsourced the idea of beacons, that there's value in coming together and saying, it's happening, people are doing this, there's a shift. It's around the world. It's not easy work. If it was, everybody would be doing it. But you're pioneers. You've been on the bleeding edge. How can you help to take it forward? And there is value in us coming together, looking around the room and saying, there's a movement. We're part of it. We can help shift the conversation, redefine the conversation in some ways, and make it count. And ultimately, we can create a world that works for all, and economies and businesses that help provide for sustainable people in our planet. That's possible. We can do it together. Thank you.
Thank you, Valerie. And as Valerie mentioned, there is a breakout session that she is facilitating later today, so she'll be around all morning. Please go find her, ask her questions, and we're going to move to the next speaker. It's my honor to introduce our next speaker, Administrator Mark Green, who leads the U.S. Agency for International Development. In this role, he leads USAID's work to end extreme poverty and enable resilient democratic societies to realize their potential. He's a recognized leader in foreign policy and the business community. Administrator Green served as the U.S. Ambassador to Tanzania from the mid-2007 to early 2009. While there, he led a mission of more than 350 Americans and Tanzanians and was ultimately responsible for some of the world's largest U.S.-led development programs. Prior to serving as U.S. Ambassador, Administrator Green served 4 terms in the U.S. House of Representatives representing Wisconsin's 8th District. While in Congress, he helped craft key policy initiatives, including the Millennium Challenge Act and President George W. Bush's history-making AIDS program, PEPFAR. Please join me in welcoming Administrator Green.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark, and thanks to all of you for being here today. First off, I'd like to begin by saying that it really shouldn't surprise anyone that the Chamber and its National Foundation want to explore opportunities in international development. After all, back in the 1980s, with the strong support of now Chamber President Tom Donahue, The foundation was an early partner in President Reagan's historic democracy program. That partnership ultimately led to the International Republican Institute, where I once worked, and of course the U.S. Chamber's own development arm, the Center for International Private Enterprise, or CITE. Tom's commitment really laid the groundwork for decades of collaboration between USAID and CITE. Following the fall of communism, we worked together to strengthen market economies in Europe and to promote democratic governance. In Hungary, we worked together to promote legal and regulatory reforms that would improve the business climate. More recently, we partnered in Belarus to bring business associations and think tanks together to advocate for reform. We helped build a coalition of 256 organizations that successfully lobbied for over 420 different reform proposals. And during this time, Belarus advanced from 106th to 37th in the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business Index. In short, I'm grateful for the work that we've done together, but I'm even more grateful for the work that we're going to do together in the months and years ahead. So, ladies and gentlemen, in the brief time that I have with you, I'd like to briefly describe what we see as 3 revolutionary changes underway in the field of development. And then I have an announcement to make that I hope you'll appreciate and enjoy, that I think will pave the way to further collaborations and further partnerships that we can all take on. So revolution number 1. The first revolution is one that shouldn't be surprising to any of you here. It's a revolution in technology. Not just the everyday discoveries, but far more importantly, the rapidly growing availability and affordability across the developing world. Now, I began my own journey in development some 30 years ago. My wife and I served as volunteer teachers in a small village in Kenya. Those were different times. In our little village, there was but one telephone. It was a wind-up telephone on a wooden box. And I remember that if you wanted to make a long-distance call, you'd pick up the receiver, turn the crank, and say something like, "Operator, give me 662 Kisumu." And you'd put the phone down, go outside, sit under the mango tree, wait for the phone to ring so the operator could tell you that your call had gone through. Just 12 years later, I visited that same village, and I came across a young boy walking along the path. I asked him if he knew Neva, one of my former students, and could he go find him for me? And he said, sure. And he picked out his mobile phone and called him. 5 years after that, I was an ambassador in East Africa, and my African staff were using cheap mobile phones to pay their bills, to conduct small business, and to make calls everywhere, all over the world. So that's the personal lens through which I see technology and the opportunities in development. It is making the impossible possible, the unsolvable solvable. In West Africa, USAID is supporting a tropical weather forecasting company called Ignitia, which is sending daily and seasonal forecasts via text message. Its forecasting model benefits 320,000 users across West Africa, giving them knowledge about rain and drought during the growing season. In Ethiopia, there are now electronic billboards all across the rural parts of the country that give smallholder farmers the latest price for coffee in the capital. The goal is to help these small farmers against the unscrupulous middlemen who might try to take advantage of their remoteness from Addis Ababa. All of this not so many miles away from that village where I once taught school. The second revolution that we see is a little more subtle, but I would argue it's no less important. And it's really the fundamental change in the relationship between America and the developing world. So when USAID was created 56 years ago, something like 80% of the financial flows between the US and the developing world were government dollars, traditional development funds, what we call ODA. Today, that figure is 9%. Now, to be clear, ODA isn't fading away, government spending isn't going down, but instead, financial flows, private financial flows, are roaring ahead. Philanthropy, remittances, but more than anything else, commerce, investment. The world's fastest growing economies are in the developing world. According to the World Bank, half the nations in Africa are now lower middle income or higher. Many of these same nations are demographically young, which means more and more of their consumers are very likely interested in the kinds of products and services that U.S. businesses make and supply. In the past decade, the international market for American goods grew by more than $200 billion, and nearly 2/3 of this growth occurred in the developing world, the countries where USAID works. I think the lesson's pretty clear. American business has business in the developing world. And I think it's fair to say that we in the Trump administration could not be more excited about the possibilities. Now, the third and final revolution I'd like to describe this morning is the one that makes me most excited as administrator. And that's the burgeoning new relationship between private enterprise and the development community. Leaders in both sectors are finally realizing, finally figuring out how to take advantage of the unique capabilities that each have and apply them to challenges that neither could fully take on alone. Problems that once seemed insurmountable. It's hard to overstate how big a shift this is for the development community. For years, whether we realized it or not, USAID and others saw donors and governments as the most important, if not the only, drivers of progress in the developing world. Private enterprise was something to keep at a distance, or perhaps try to bend to our will. We welcomed donations from private enterprise. We were even willing to contract with private business to obtain goods and services. Today, all that's changing. We're trying to move beyond contracting and grant making to collaborating, co-financing, co-designing programs, tools, initiatives. Today, we're recognizing that agencies like USAID don't need to be the sole actors in the development space when we can more effectively serve as catalytic actors in that space. We're rethinking how international development initiatives are designed and tested and rolled out. We're embracing the creativity and the entrepreneurship that the private sector brings. I'll give you an example. A few weeks ago, at the World Food Prize sessions in Iowa, I announced our partnership with Syngenta. Working with Syngenta under the umbrella of our Feed the Future initiative, we will help local African agribusinesses gain access to high-quality seeds to sell at affordable prices. Now, to be clear, we're not simply buying those seeds and donating them to farmers. That's what we would have done in the past. Instead, what we're doing is using our vast networks and relationships. We're connecting the labs that develop cutting-edge seed varieties with the remote farmers and communities that desperately need them. In the places where Feed the Future is working like this, we estimate that poverty has dropped an average of 19%. As those farmers' incomes rise, they want to purchase American farm equipment, IT equipment. As they really rise, maybe a John Deere or a Ford. And given where I come from, if they really rise, maybe a Harley or a Trek. We believe in the power of private enterprise. We believe that private enterprise is the only sustainable way to lift lives, to build communities. And so we're dedicated to work to find ways to ease the barriers for businesses to participate. For example, from 2001 to 2013, USAID invested about $30 million to help Vietnam improve its domestic business regulatory environment and open its economy to foreign competition. Over that same time, we've seen U.S. exports to Vietnam increase from about $460 million to more than $10 billion today. To better systemize our work supporting global trade, we have created something called the Global Alliance for Trade Facilitation. The Alliance is our first public-private partnership specifically aimed at supporting efforts to eliminate red tape for all of you at the borders. It's a new way to deliver assistance, and it's a success in part due to the on-the-ground expertise that our key partner, your very own CIPE, brings to the table. Through the Alliance, we're joining with other bilateral donor countries and private sector companies, including several Chamber members, to pool financial and in-kind resources for targeted technical assistance. For the first time, companies, through the Alliance, have a say in determining the countries where assistance dollars will be spent and what activities will actually take place. We're using commercially meaningful measures of the time and cost to move goods across borders to ensure that we have an impact both on development, which is our mission, and business. In Vietnam, for example, the Alliance is working with high-level government officials in multiple ministries and the private sector to establish a new bond system, which will allow goods to be cleared much more quickly, lowering the cost for business. In Colombia, CIPE has led Alliance efforts with Colombia's National Food and Drug Monitoring Institute. Next month, thanks to CIPE, a new automated clearance system will be launched which will make it easier for U.S. producers to import agricultural products into Colombia. And now for the announcement. Today, I'm announcing that we are expanding the Global Alliance for Trade Facilitation from its initial pilot roster of 4 countries to 20. And we're especially excited because we believe that the new alliance-focused countries, including Argentina, Brazil, and Sri Lanka, they represent some of the most exciting opportunities in some of the most important emerging export markets worldwide. This is good for business, but we believe it's just as good for development. Nothing attacks poverty, nothing lifts lives, nothing pushes back against hopelessness and despair, nothing better than inclusive economic growth. So I hope the thrust of my message is clear. The future of international development is enterprise-driven. And we at USAID, working with all of you, we will embrace it. In the Trump administration, we believe the purpose of foreign assistance must be to end the need for its existence. And that only happens with the power of private enterprise. We are here to encourage the Chamber and its members to join us in this effort and even make a buck or two along the way. So thank you for all that you've done. Thanks for your partnership. We're going to expand that partnership, and I think we're going to do it in ways that will be good for business, good for development, and really expand those principles and values that bring us all here together. Thank you. Good morning.
And now, to facilitate our Shaping the Future of Global Development panel, the President and General Counsel, DSM, and Chair of the Corporate Citizenship Center Advisory Board, Hugh Welsh.
I almost feel like I have to perform when I hear, my introduction like that. For me, it's been a very exciting morning already. I'm encouraged to hear the remarks of Ambassador Green and Valerie as well. I know she's working with DSM to help drive our own purpose project. But this morning, I have the privilege of bringing up a panel of experts in the area of implementing, of, as Valerie said, moving from the rhetoric to the reality of how the private sector can work together with the public sector. So for the last few years, I've been coming to this event. I've heard a lot of remarks around public-private partnership. It's almost become cliche. I've heard a lot of conversations around the Sustainable Development Goals and how they offer a business case But this morning we're going to talk a little bit about what that looks like in reality. So I'd like to welcome Sarah Thorne, the Senior Director of Global Government Affairs for Walmart, Saba Sobhani, the Global Private Sector Program Advisor with the UN Development Program, and David Weiss, the President and CEO of Global Communities. And I'm going to facilitate a conversation with them around what the future of global development might look like. So Sarah, how are you this morning?
I'm feeling very cozy here in my
It's a very comfortable environment they've created for us. Tell me a little bit about what Walmart's working on with respect to its 2025 plan, and really what is the reality we're seeing today in the private sector in engaging in some of these public-private partnerships and development?
Thanks, and it's always a pleasure to be here. This is a very timely discussion, and I think a lot of the remarks that Administrator Green just made are very resonant to the discussion we're going to have here. So, you know, we've been on, at Walmart, sort of a development journey for a while. And some of the reason that we've been on this journey is because we're kind of new to the international marketplace. Today, we're in 28 markets around the world. We source from about 50 different countries, but just 30, 40 years ago, we were not an international company. And as we've become a global company, we've become more engaged in international development because many of the countries in which we are sourcing or have retail operations are emerging markets. And so this journey has been from sort of the public-private partnership, as Administrator Green discussed, from I'm going to give you some money and you're going to do something good, to what are the core capabilities of my business, and really what is the purpose of my business? So, and how does development impact that? So as Walmart, people don't think about this, but we're largely a grocer. We're in fact the world's largest grocer. And so when we think about expanding that, we have to think about what are the systems that support being a grocer. So it really is about people and planet. So what are the systems for agricultural development, for procuring fresh food, and making sure that's sustainable? And then what about the people in that supply chain, and how are those people, how are they treated in the supply chain, and how are they given opportunity? And so we've really shifted from thinking about project-based development to really systems changed around that singular purpose of our mission, which is saving people money so they can live better. So it really is from project to sort of program, and to think about how we tackle really big issues from a systems perspective. It means that we don't get a lot of quick wins anymore because we're tackling things like, how do we feed a planet that's going to be how many billion people in the future? What do we do about issues like dignity at work and forced labor? These are intractable issues that have challenged us for years. Poverty, inequality of opportunity. But we feel like as really the largest company in the world, not only is this now something that we can affect, it's something that there's an expectation that we try to affect. So what does that mean for development? That means we need a lot more collaboration. In the past, we've sort of had our programs, and we label them, they're my programs, we put nice titles on them. And in a way, it was because a lot of what we were doing was for license to operate, corporate responsibility, more of a messaging. I think now we're just saying we want to get the work done, and we want to collaborate with anybody who wants to do it with us, because we're going after these big systems issues, and we can't do it alone. But it also means that government is important. And, you know, as much as I liked what Administrator Green said about leveraging the power of business, because for me, it's not just about philanthropy, it's about how do I source more inclusively? How do I hire more inclusively? But we need that framework of government and public policy and private policy together to make it work. I'll give you one short example. The issue of forced labor is a huge issue. It's an issue probably companies weren't even talking about a couple of years ago. But it's an issue that affects millions of people in supply chains and deep in supply chains. To go after that issue, we need to work with other businesses like we are through CGF. We need to work with NGOs like the International Justice Mission and Project Azara, and we need to work with governments because it's about laws and enforcement that actually creates the conditions forced labor. And so we are working collaboratively and collectively on these issues, but it's going to take a long time. We don't get a lot of quick wins, but we need all of those people working to affect that kind of systems change. So I would say the future of development is long, but it's an exciting time. And I think, as a practitioner, it's a really interesting time to be thinking differently about how we work together and how we set really big goals for our companies to try to go after.
Thank you. Saba. I've had the privilege of working with the UN now for more than 10 years across multiple agencies. I still really don't know how it all works.
Right.
It's a black hole in some respects. Can you help us understand how the private sector gets the opportunity to engage with the UN development?
Sure. I mean, I think the UN, like yourself, is undertaking a journey of its own in the last 10, 15 years. I mean, we've been set up originally as an intergovernmental sort of body and mechanism, but increasingly in the world of complexity where you have so many stakeholders, we've had different types of engagement with the private sector. I think individual partnerships like the ones that we've had with yours has been part of the initial set of activities around CSR, around some core business initiatives, but we also realize that it's about systems change. I think that's the key sort of takeaway. We realize that we have all of these big numbers about the business case for the SDGs. $12 trillion, the Business Commission say, in terms of economic opportunities. You have different kinds of opportunities, but how do we unlock this? And I think it's not just about pioneer firms trying to forge their way. They have an important role, but we need to deal with both the internal and external sort of challenges that they face. Earlier we talked about the internal challenges, Valerie, but I think the UN's role and UNDP's role really is to de-risk, support, provide a market intelligence, build the platforms that will help companies enter these markets. So the way we've been thinking about it, and UNDP, as some may know, may not know, is actually the UN that coordinates all the UN activities on the ground. So we think of ourselves as, because we have over 144 country offices, as the largest public multinationals in the multilateral systems, working in difficult geographies from Liberia to, in China, where we're working with in all kinds of interesting areas. We created a new framework where we talk about the 3 C's: convene, catalyze, and capitalize around the SDGs. We believe that we need to convene collective action platforms around different kinds of issues. One example we have, for example, with UPS and Boston Consulting Firm and a number of other American corporates, is we're trying to set up local business networks to address disaster issues with OCHA, so inter-EU agency. We have 13 business networks, and the fundamental thing we realize, if we build these local architecture for emergency response, early recovery, you might not need as much of stuff flowing from outside. And you also need to build business resilience. 90% of firms that have closed within the first month after a disaster, if they close, they don't reopen. So just an example, 8 out of the 13 platforms that we've set up have been hit with different kinds of disasters. In Madagascar, and you have a lot of hidden assets in the corporate community. Telecom companies have aviation, they deploy helicopters, 15 helicopters in Madagascar. In Sri Lanka, the equivalent of Uber picked up. So around catalyze, I think very much our work, UNDP specifically has the largest portfolio of environmental types of projects in the UN system. So we do de-risking around renewable. We've done a lot of work with corporates, make the business case in Tunisia and other countries. And I think the big thing we're trying to crack, and the UN, to be fair, hasn't been as much engaged, is how do we mobilize capital for the SDGs? How do we use things from innovative financing methods like social bonds and others to green bonds, to more traditional type of capital to get into markets. One project, for example, I'm looking at is I'm convinced that private equity can be a force for good in developing countries, because when you invest in SMEs and you're part of those companies, you can change the way they do things.
Can you say that again? Private equity is a force for good?
Can be a force for good, yes. You look at the Middle East, in many of these countries, if these SMEs hired refugees, as part of their 7-8% of their workforce, and they had the right ESG standards. I think the best entry point is through the investors that are investing in those. So that's the sort of framing we're looking at.
Just from a practical sense, how does the private sector engage with you? Do they just call you up and say, hey, can you take a meeting? We want to work out a memorandum.
So as I said, I think the platforms, like the connecting business, they're platforms, they're global platforms, like the business call to action we have with USAID. I think that's one entry point, because there you can think about services like impact management, other things. We have our specialized agencies like WFP have a core procurement or nexus of procurement and other sort of things where I think there's an opportunity to engage. The other one is look at the markets you're in, prioritize, and then we definitely can have a conversation. We have corporate sort of players, but also the UN, as you know, is very decentralized. So I think the country offers entry point. There's also an internal, I would add another C, which is capacity. There's an internal change management processing that we're doing to try to engage people to become much more able to partner with the private sector like other folks.
Okay, thanks. David. I used to say DSM was the biggest company that nobody ever heard of. I think you're now with an NGO that might be the biggest NGO that nobody ever heard of.
That may well be the case.
Let's end that today. Tell me a little bit about Global Communities.
Yeah, well, Global Communities formerly started as the Cooperative Housing Foundation 65 years ago. We were doing co-op housing, low-income housing in the U.S., morphed into an international organization, became CHF International. I hate acronyms, so I rebranded to something I hopefully would be more recognizable as Global Communities. But today we are working virtually across every sector of international development, with the exception of clinical health, but we do a lot of preventive health programs, infrastructure, agricultural development, health. As I mentioned, financial inclusion is an important part of what we do, and it gets to, we can come back to this later perhaps, but private equity is another way of financing development. And humanitarian assistance. And it's for obviously regrettable reasons, but humanitarian assistance is the fastest growing part of our business. And I would put an emphasis on saying that we are a business. I think, Administrator Green was alluding to the sort of the change in how development has been financed over the last 25 or 30 years from where we were once, about 8% private sector financed in international development to today where it's 91% financed by the private sector. And that evolution, NGOs, who I think back in those early days were probably viewed by the corporate sector as, fuzzy-headed do-gooders, but we've evolved a lot too, and we have to run our organizations like a business where many of us, like Global Communities, are hybrids, where we're a for-profit parent, but we have lots of nonprofit entities. And so that evolution and the increasing amount of partnerships, number of partnerships that we're doing, not just with the public sector, but with the private sector, are critically important in development. And I think in an era where resources are becoming scarcer on the public sector side, and those resources are critically important because they, as much as the private sector is financing development these days, there are gaps that can only be done by the public sector, and those public-private partnerships become critically important. And I think the real name of the game in an era of scarce resources is how can we better leverage those resources, and that a lot of that comes through public-private partnerships. I'll give you one quick example. It's one of my favorites of where we really feel we get the most bang for the buck. We partner quite a bit with the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, OPIC. And OPIC will put up loan guarantees that will enable or incentivize banks that won't lend traditionally to lower income businesses. And in many of the countries where we work, those lower income enterprises are the fastest growing parts of the economy. But with the loan guarantees, they will now lend. So we're leveraging private capital through the banks. With a very small grant component, we can do the technical assistance basically to train the bank lending officers in what to look for in a small business they're going to lend to. Train the business owners in how to put together a business plan and their back office accounting functions and things like that. And for a very tiny amount of money, you're basically getting huge bang for the buck in the sense of job creation. And I got to tell you, in a lot of parts of the world where we work, and I'll use the Middle East as maybe the best example of this, but these are tough neighborhoods. And if you can't, in development, continue to be creating jobs that are getting people into something productive rather than hanging out idly on a street corner, you're not only helping to improve the economy and set an enabling environment for business, but you're also doing something to avoid having more people being recruited by extremist groups.
That's great. The NGOs that you work with, and I know you've been around for 60 years now, you're operating in 25 different countries, they're largely the implementers for a lot of the work that we want to do. How do you help them prioritize in a world where it seems everything is important today?
Well, I think there's a broad spectrum of how our corporate partners sort of approach work and development. You go back to sort of the traditional sort of approach of CSR through the corporate foundation at one end of the spectrum to the shared value, so-called shared value notion that companies are increasingly moving toward today, where CSR or philanthropy is an integral part of corporate strategy. And depending on the company, the nature of the company, most companies will have particular areas of focus in terms of the kinds of development work that they think are most conducive to that strategic push for the company, and they look to very specific geographic areas as well as to where they're pushing to increase a market presence or open into a new market. And we work with them, and in some cases, and I think in the ideal case with corporate partners, we really literally co-design programs that will meet their interests and the interests of development that we as an implementing partner are pushing.
I mean, Sarah, that's got to be encouraging to hear, especially working on co-development, both with the UN and with the various NGOs. But you and I have been at this for a while. We know that we approach a lot of, I'd say, non-private sector actors, and what they're really interested in is funding. How do we work to convince them that we have so much more to bring than just a checkbook?
Yeah, so I actually think we've actually crossed over on that issue in that, one of the first areas that we started to get really engaged in was agriculture as a grocer. Perishable and seasonal agriculture is not something you move very well around the world. And so we became very interested in figuring out how we could make farmers more productive. And one of the things we had to do with implementing partners was move back up the chain, the co-collaboration and the co-design. Because what would happen in the past was donors would, many of the NGOs or governments would come to us at the end of a project and say, can you buy our Project X, our beans, our rice, our corn? And we would say, well, no, we want cilantro, we want tomatoes, we want onions, and we want them at this standards, and we want this quality and this growing season. And so there was a mismatch both in terms of oftentimes geography as well as product type, and we were not being utilized in a way that we could be utilized with the power of our business. And so we've had to back it up, and we've been doing this for probably about 10 years now, saying we do buy a lot of stuff and we hire a lot of people. Those are really strategic assets. So how do we put that first in terms of the buying and hiring, and then we use philanthropy to fill the gaps. But it means coming in earlier in the process and earlier in the design process, whether you're with USAID or an NGO. And in fact, we found that sometimes when we did philanthropically enabled projects, they were not as successful because you had self-dealing. So we couldn't be the buyer because we used our philanthropic money, and then we couldn't self-deal and then take what we were purchasing. It's hard. Ambassador Green, Administrator Green talked about the Global Alliance for Trade Facilitation. Walmart's on the steering committee of that, and I have sat in rooms with DFID, USAID, GIZ, AusAid, and we speak different languages.
In acronyms, apparently.
And log frames, and these things that as a private sector you just want to strangle somebody because it's all of this process before you can even get to the project. But I will say I think the end result of that kind of systemic torture for a private sector person is a better result in terms of co-collaboration and design. And trade facilitation, no matter what we're doing, is the fundamental building block of trade. And so I'm so excited he talked about it, because it's such an innovative and new project. But it has been a real, if you talk to all of the partners, it's taken us a long time to get on the same page, to work together collaboratively, and to get to the implementation process.
Sabi, you're nodding knowingly.
Yeah,
you're not guilty of torturing the private sector, are you?
Ambassador Green, I think there's a complementary role for us to work at the UN in terms of also, let's not forget, the local ecosystem of actors, especially in the governments. I worked closely with the Bureau of Investment in the Philippines, where they were basically trying to see how can we catalyze more sustainable kind of foreign direct investments, what can we learn from other countries. I think we have to see how the fantastic sort of global corporate agenda can also be linked. We can link them up to local governments, and because now there's a lot of fiscal space in many of these countries, and they're interested in these other things. I think the other thing which is also interesting, I've noticed recently a fantastic set of strong commitments, strategies coming from family-owned companies in developing countries. And many of them are in your supply chains and others. I think these are the types, private equity, family-owned companies, different types of the business ecosystem we need to really, are hidden assets that we need to really use in maximizing impact and local.
Can I challenge him a little bit?
Okay. Of course, I would.
Spice it up a little bit.
I'm not here to.
It's hard for private sector to work with the UN. You guys are so big, and it becomes CEO-led. You have your golden children CEOs that you work with, and then you get projects. So how do you make it easier for us to work with you? What's the portal? Here's what we're doing. How do we co-collaborate? Because we're working in parallel with you,
right,
but we're not working in collaboration
with the system. I think these new types of collective platform initiatives that are country-focused, right? When in a country, I'll give you one example. In Kenya, the government of Kenya, with Philips and others, a number of companies, decided that we want to influence access to health within that context, right? That's where I think the power of the UN can be really unleashed in that kind of context. We've had a lot of these, the first generation of the relationships we've had really has been the visibility, branding-driven kinds of collaborations between large corporates and the UN. But I think there's a whole set of different kinds of. So I would suggest identify your countries, think about how you can connect to the local offices, and then that'll be the best entry. And what are the platforms, issue-based platforms that you can do?
Yeah. David, you heard Administrator Green say that the fastest growing economies in the world are in the developing world. And we see that, we know that. And we see this also as a means by which to move in to some of those fast growing economies to help grow our businesses, not just profitably, but sustainably. How do you work with the NGOs that you help coach, train, teach to encourage large multinationals to come work with them in those developing countries?
Well, I think it's not so much a question of sort of how do we encourage multinationals to come in to those kinds of markets. They're coming in there. And I think, for NGOs like us who have been in these countries for, literally decades, and know the countries, know the people, and our organization, we put a huge amount of emphasis on the way that we implement projects. And virtually any sector, any project that we're doing starts with how do we engage and empower the community that we're trying to assist. Because we know that by engaging them and learning what their priorities are and having them get that, have that buy-in, that ultimately that's what will make any project sustainable. And I think, increasingly we have found in working with corporate partners that they see that in NGOs, that NGOs have that to offer, and those are areas and markets that they're moving into. I'll give just picking up something that Sarah was saying earlier, I'll give a very quick, easy little example, but it's the kind of thing we see, literally all over the world in the kind of partnerships we have. We had been working for, quite a number of years in India with John Deere. Started as the more traditional kind of grant to do some, some good works in an area where, they had some investments but John Deere was also starting to produce tractors, manufacture tractors in India. But they started to recognize that they're not going to be able to sell that many tractors if you can't have skilled people who know how to repair them. And so we collaborated with John Deere to develop a small little program to train people on how to repair John Deere tractors. That's the kind of thing where you get that kind of symbiosis that I think really starts to make things click. We've expanded our relationship with John Deere and many other countries since that time. But that's, I think, where these kinds of partnerships are heading.
And I think that's lost on many private sector partners, that they have the opportunity to work with you, with NGOs, to craft what a program might look like going forward, that not just helps solve a problem in the local community, but also enables the business going forward. And I think the more we get that message out, I think the more helpful it would be.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wanted to pick up on Saba's twice now mentioned private equity, but this is another place we found, and particularly in the Middle East, we have a couple of countries where we're working where we have had private equity investors come to us. We didn't have to seek them out, but they have come to us because we have microfinance programs, in one case in Egypt, another case in Lebanon, just as two examples. And those private equity investors recognize that those are very successful kinds of operations and are interested in investing. We're craving that kind of equity investment because that's the way that we can expand, is bringing in that kind of equity capital. And they're great partnerships, and they really work well. And they cost very little, and they produce good profits.
Excellent. Sarah, how do you drive this down in the organization at Walmart? So I know you spend a lot of time. I follow you on social media. You're all over the world. How do you drive down what you're trying to accomplish and what the shared value message of Walmart is down to the associate level?
I think for us, it starts at the top, actually. And we're incredibly fortunate that we have and have had a leadership that understands the role of Walmart in society. And that our founder, it sounds sort of corny, but Sam Walton was about helping people live better. He thought about, the fact that in rural America there was not good access to products and services. And that's the foundation of the company, which is really about bringing goods and services to people who didn't have that opportunity so that they can then save that money to invest in their family. So when you start with that philosophy, it really isn't that hard to think about, okay, now that we're a really big company with over 2 million people working for us, how do you bring that up and then bring them back down? So when we look at this, though, we think about in 3 sort of buckets of work. Sustainability, which is sort of little s, meaning environmental, but also people and planet. So people is a really important part of that. Opportunity, which is really economic development, and that's really where associates can benefit, but also teach and train. And then community, and that is very focused on that story of the community and what are we doing to be a good actor. And so throughout that, there are opportunities for our associates not only to benefit but to engage with their local communities. I'll give you an example. We have a program, we've been working really hard on entrepreneurship and women's entrepreneurship and working with the Citizenship Center on these issues, but we found that we could work with an NGO to teach them to train entrepreneurs, or we could just have the guys and the women that buy for us adopt small businesses. So in Mexico, we have a program called Adopta una Pyme. So adopt a small business, bring them in, teach them about how do you do your financials? How do you market your product? How do you think about innovation? Because many small businesses have one product to sell you, but you need variety. How do you distribute your product? That's just knowledge our folks have, and the return on that investment is incredible in terms of the retention of those suppliers in our supply chain. So taking that learning and how do you spread something like that around, I would say then, the associates feel so committed to the company because they see the power of just their knowledge in transforming societies. So it's really thinking
You see
about
that
it.
purpose sort of driven approach as a real magnet, creating stickiness with your talent?
I do think so. I mean, when I joined Walmart, it was a hard place to work because people would say to you, why are you working for Walmart? I mean, some of that was, our reputation sort of got ahead of us, and we weren't talking about who we were as a company as effectively. But now I feel like I see these younger kids coming in who want to work for Walmart because we can affect such change. And certainly it's kept me at Walmart as long as I have, because the opportunity and having that runway to say, how do we become a better citizen? How do we use our strength for good? It's transformative and it's exciting.
I just want to pick up something Sarah said about knowledge, having the knowledge and lessons learned. I think one thing we're not doing enough, it's been repeated previously, but learning from failures. I've been involved in many failures, and I think that some of the lessons learned I've had, there's a ripeness and timing to do certain things. You know, when pioneer firms enter certain markets, we have to understand, is this just a missing market opportunity or is it a missing market? So we really need to do a lot more about we have enough of evidence and database of what works and what doesn't work around some of these sustainable business models, and we need more opportunities to share that. For me, fundamentally, getting local actors in the local ecosystem with skin in the game is key. If they don't have skin in the game, you know, all the rocket science TOCs or whatever you have is not going to make it. And understanding the political economy. So these are the things I think from the UN we can also, we hope to play a better role in engaging with companies. It's not just...
Look, the UN is a lightning rod for criticism many times, particularly from the private sector, but it is a core enabler going forward for global development. Right. And you know, we in DSM started 10 years ago with a basic memorandum of understanding, and today we have a partnership that's flourishing in Rwanda and elsewhere.
Yeah, exactly.
So the change has been profound. How do you see that change continuing for the next 5 years to become even more?
I think the key issue for us in involving other actors like investors and other players in the business puzzle, because if we don't involve those, then it'll be, and also the local governments also. Those are the two key things. We can play complementary roles to sort of complement the work that Ambassador Green talked about, that USAID and other bilateral donors are leading.
I think, Hugh, there's another angle to this. I mean, you just used the term enabler. And, you know, I think there's a lot of places, and I had mentioned earlier myself that there is, even though it's getting smaller, there's a critical role for the public sector financing as well in development, because there are gaps there that the private sector is not going to finance. And when you put them together in these public-private partnerships, it really comes down to creating an enabling environment. So there are things that we do, for example, as an NGO, with public funding that we get, where we're working with governments on local governance, on transparency, not to mention more traditional things like infrastructure and creating access to, you know, power, electricity, and building roads and that sort of thing. But when you put it all together, creating a healthy workforce, you're creating an enabling environment for business in many of these countries. And these are, in a lot of countries, I mean, it's, you know, everyone knows there's, you know, high levels of corruption, poor governance, non-transparency, and I think where a lot of corporate partnerships can be very successful with NGOs is when there's that recognition that there is an enabling environment that we can help to create and help to build, and then work in partnership with a corporate partner in moving forward.
How do you deal with the challenge of in the developed world, in the donor countries, budgets are getting cut? Governments are becoming much more transactional and looking to the private sector as sort of not the enabler, not the collaborator, but the bank. I mean, how can we work, how can you help us work with these donor countries to help see the shared responsibility in creating that shared value?
Well, it's really tough, and we're in an environment now where there's a lot of pressure on public financing. You know, USAID funding has been shrinking. We'll see where Congress comes out on the FY18 budget, but it's a very tough environment. And I think we have to look very, you know, sort of more strategically in how we can maximize the use of these resources. And, you know, I keep coming back to this, but it is a question of leveraging in terms of public-private partnerships and recognizing that these are certain areas that the public sector is going to fund. These are areas where corporations come in and they can help either through grant funding through their foundations or through equity investments or however works best, but it's doing it collaboratively to make sure we're doing it the best way possible. The other piece of it is working more efficiently, and we do, that's comes through, more innovation, through, technology and so on. I mean, we all have to be operating as efficiently as we can, and that's something that we work on every day.
Well, we have just a few minutes here, and I'm not paying attention to the lights that are flashing consciously. In just a couple of words, why don't each of you sum up what you see as the future of global development?
Yeah, I hope the future of global development is collaboration. I don't even really like the term development because it's sort of imperial, isn't it? Yeah. You know what I mean? We get to develop. I actually think it's about opportunity and how we collaborate to create better opportunity for people around the world. I do think there's a limit, though. It's a little dangerous to kind of put this public-private partnership as the panacea. It's not. I've seen, areas where we just have a mismatch of what our goals are and the level of development in emerging markets. And sometimes it's okay to get a farmer to a level of sustainability and not selling to the market. And so we need the public sector. I'm really distressed about sort of the budget situation and USAID and not filling those positions. Like, we need those officers out there for that kind of partnership and doing that kind of work that we're just not going to get to as the private sector. So I would say hopefully the future is collaboration, but collaboration with all parties.
Yes. Going back to, I think, these building really these ecosystem with different actors, new entrants to the, I just saw that India is going to give $150 million to the UN to support different projects. China is giving us funding. I think there's an opportunity to bring all these players also to the table and shape these local ecosystem where people have skin in the game and also have the right roles and responsibilities and functions. That would be.
Bring us home, David.
The one thing that no one's mentioned is the huge number and size of humanitarian crises, which in some ways are sapping funds that would otherwise be available for longer-term development and for creating the future of development. We've got 4 famines in Somalia, South Sudan, Yemen, northeast Nigeria, 20 million people threatened with starvation. You've got the war in Syria where the pre-war population of 22 million, of that, 2/3 of them are in need of humanitarian assistance. Half of those, a little more than half of those, are still inside of Syria. The rest are refugees, which has created all kinds of not only economic and social issues, but political issues. And as we try to address those, it's complicating how we can keep our eye on the ball of the longer-term development, and it is sapping resources. And so I think where I'm going with this is that there's a lot of talk now, and it's in its early stages, but there need to be new and better ways of financing development. There's a lot of creative people have talked about development impact bonds, even humanitarian impact bonds. They haven't, there's a few cases that are being sort of tested, but that has a long way to go before that is efficient from a dollars and cents standpoint. But private equity, social enterprise, I think is going to play an increasingly large role. And I think all of us need, not just in the NGO sector, but all of us, whether it's corporate sector or multilaterals, we all need to start adapting to these other kinds of models if we're going to effectively address the future of development. And let's face it, there's been huge progress made in international development in the last 25 or 30 years. I mean, cutting extreme poverty in half and half again, and reducing malnutrition and child mortality and inoculating people against diseases. But we need to keep charging ahead with that and not be held back by the lack of resources and by the kind of overbearing now humanitarian crises that are really sapping things. We need to find solutions to those.
Just one point to add that wasn't mentioned. There's an opportunity also to learn from the resilience of what you see in developing countries, in our own countries, like in the US here. In the Philippines, the business network that we're working with is building its own emergency operations center in a military base to deal with all these disasters. They become so good at it, they can send SWAT teams of medical folks in flood zones. They offer to come and help in Puerto Rico, you know, because they have those capabilities. So there's an opportunity also of learning the other way.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm grateful for all of you sharing your insights this morning. You come at this from a very different perspective, but also have a good insight into how the others work. And I'm also grateful that we're not just sharing the opportunities, but the challenges as well. And I hope that serves as a catalyst for the conversation we're going to collectively have over the next 2 days. And I want to encourage everybody to reach out to all of these esteemed panelists to get better insight into how the private sector works, UN agencies work, and of course the NGO community. So we're going to end now. Please help me thank all of our panelists for their tremendous insight.
I've been involved behind the scenes.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Group Vice President, Corporate Affairs, The Kroger Company, and President of the Kroger Foundation, Jessica Edelman.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jessica Edelman, and I left Washington, D.C. 2 years ago to go work for the Kroger Company in Cincinnati, Ohio. Now, let me be clear. Cincinnati was never necessarily on my bucket list of things to do. In fact, when you're from Washington and you live in this world, Ohio in general is a place that you think about once every 4 years, forget about it for a while, and then it suddenly pops back up. You know how that happens during an election cycle? But it wasn't an easy choice for me to leave Washington. Now, unlike Valerie, don't think I was raised in a cult. Those of you who know Washington, others might beg to differ. And if I was, I haven't found out about it yet, and the rules are pretty lenient. So I know, though, that I did grow up here in Arlington, Virginia, and my whole life has really been centered around Washington. And in fact, today my dad is here doing what he does best, which is to cheer me on. So hi, Dad, wherever you are out there. Hi, Dad, yay, yay for dads. Dads are great. But anyway, I fell into the food supply chain almost by accident. I even tried to escape it a few times. I went and I lived in Russia for a few years. I went back to business school. I lived in Minnesota. I mean, I really kind of tried everything. But despite my best efforts, I'm standing up here today in front of you as Group Vice President and Head of Corporate Affairs for the Kroger Co., which is one of the world's largest grocers. Now, I had shopped Harris Teeter, so if you're from this area, you know our Harris Teeter stores, or maybe if you're from the Ralph's or from the West Coast, you know Ralph's or some of our other banners. But Kroger is the world's third largest retailer, and we're an American grocer. We have a huge footprint, and in fact, we welcome 9 million plus people every day into our stores. So I realized I love the food sector. And the reason I feel so excited to be standing up here on the podium today is I believe that the food industry and getting to work for Kroger is perhaps one of the most purpose-driven places that I can be today. When we talk about opportunity forward, which is the topic of the conference, I think the food retail industry is a great example that we should be focusing on. First, let's start with the obvious. The margins are really thin. It's hyper-competitive. Price is everything. You can go to a grocery store almost on any single corner. So why, in today's crazy environment, would Kroger choose to talk about a huge social impact plan? Well, we've been talking about it all day so far. Organizations need to be looking ahead, and they need to understand what are the societal expectations for companies out there in order to remain relevant. And at Kroger, we don't want to be your grandparents' grocery store. We're setting out to redefine the customer experience and to partner with others to create customer value. Our customers, our employees, and our stakeholders care deeply about what we do for each other, for our communities, and for the planet. And this translates directly into our ability to grow the business and to create shareholder value. Like everything at Kroger, our social impact work is data-driven. Just this year, Kroger was named to the top 60 most reputable companies in the United States on the prestigious RepTrak survey. That translates directly into more willingness to buy from us and willingness to promote us. Our social impact commitments then convert directly into loyalty from customers and employees, which translates into sales. We fundamentally believe that our stores are a competitive advantage. You'll hear it all the time. I have CNBC running all day in my office. I hear all day long how bricks and mortar is dead, retail is over. But we believe at Kroger that our stores are an incredible competitive advantage. And that's because they provide us the physical venue for community connection. And that converts into competitive advantage for Kroger. And that's why I am so excited and proud to be here today to share with you our bold social impact plan that we have put together in order to stand out in the minds of the American consumer. We call it Zero Hunger, Zero Waste. Now, 134 years in the grocery business has taught us a few things about people and about food. We know that meals matter. Families that share meals together have children who do better in all aspects of their lives. And yet, there is a fundamental absurdity in the US food system today, which is that 40% of the food that's produced in our food system gets thrown away. But yet 1 in 8 people struggles with hunger. And that number goes up to 1 in 6 when we talk about kids. So we throw 40% of the food away, yet at the same time, 1 in 8 or 1 in 6 people struggles with hunger. When I say that to my 5-year-old, for example, he just says, "But Mommy, that makes no sense." And I think he's right on this point in particular. But we know at Kroger that we can do something about it. And more importantly, we think we can do something better than anybody else because of our history and where we're positioned to make a true difference in how America eats and the way we think about zero hunger and zero waste. Kroger's vision is to end hunger in our communities and to eliminate waste across the company by 2025. We have tremendous scale. We have the physical assets, technology, resources, and our incredible people. There are 450,000 strong, passionate individuals with a consistent track record of doing great and really difficult things who work at Kroger. And our customers reward us for that. Kroger's Zero Hunger, Zero Waste plan is multifaceted, and it's going to continue to evolve. But here is how we're going to go ahead and get started. A few years ago, we put an extra $10 million into our Kroger Foundation. We're going to use this money now going forward to crowdsource innovative ideas in order to help us meet these goals. We're going to accelerate our food donations. Kroger was a founding member in the 70s of Feeding America. We were there on day one and helped found that organization. And in fact, we've donated 1 billion meals in the past 4 years. We're going to accelerate that. We're going to do 1 billion between now and 2020, and we're going to do 3 billion meals by 2025. And we know we can do that just by improving the execution in our stores. We're not going to only just donate more food, more quantity of food. We're also going to donate better food, more nutritious food, more fresh product. And we're going to inspire people to know what to do with that kale when they see it on the shelves of the food bank. We're going to have recipe banks. We're going to think about ways that even if you've never interacted with fresh produce before or understood what's possible, to help it be accessible and to help inspire you no matter what your circumstances are. We're going to continue on our journey to become a zero waste company, something that we announced in our sustainability goals for 2020. Today, 31 out of 33 of our manufacturing plants are zero waste already. And our logistics team has achieved a 97% diversion from landfill in their supply chain today. Our stores are also on track to become zero waste by 2020 and are doing a great job on their journey as well. Plus, we're reducing energy usage by 40% by 2020. When we reduce electricity, waste, and carbon, we reduce costs that can be reinvested into the business. And our efforts have led to Kroger being named to the prestigious Dow Jones Sustainability Index for the 5th consecutive year. Beyond our zero waste to landfill goals, we're going to work with outside partners to become a zero food waste company by 2025. Zero food waste means less methane, because when food goes to a landfill, it ends up producing methane, which is a greenhouse gas 23 times as potent and as destructive to the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. And customers, stakeholders, policymakers, shoppers, just like you guys, you all care about that. You care about that a lot, and so do we. We're going to use our reputation to advocate for zero hunger, zero waste, public policy-oriented solutions at all levels of government, which is going to include getting involved in the Farm Bill negotiations and reauthorization in this upcoming cycle. Now, we know we can't do it alone. It's going to take all of us working together. It's really our moonshot, and if it could have been done, we probably would have already done it. But we've set this big goal out there, and we're going to work together to try to find partners to help us to achieve it. Right now, we're partnering up with some of our most trusted partners with whom we have great history. That includes Feeding America and also the World Wildlife Fund. Finally, we've teamed up with our colleagues down the street at our, what I call it affectionately, our little nerd company of data scientists to figure out how the data and the science can help us figure out which are the communities that we have a real shot in transforming and changing between now and 2025. We did a hackathon a few weeks ago where we had our data scientists run regressions on our customer data, on Feeding America's map the food gap data, and then on food waste data to figure out where were those groups that intersected the most, where we could really, truly have a shot at creating a zero hunger, zero waste community by 2025. Again, In today's crazy, competitive, embattled landscape, it might be feel like a strange time to announce a major social impact initiative. But here's the thing. Zero Hunger, Zero Waste isn't actually a new initiative. We've been fighting hunger and reducing waste across Kroger for years now. And our Zero Hunger, Zero Waste plan gives us a simple and forward-looking way to ensure our customers, our talent, and society understand how our communities and working in them is a key point of differentiation for Kroger. Our future success depends on people wanting to shop with us, work for us, and partner with us. And they're going to do that when their values align with our values. Zero Hunger, Zero Waste is about authentically sharing what we're really passionate about. And so it can be crystal clear what Kroger stands for with our purpose. And now, more than ever, being a good steward of the planet and of our communities means that Kroger is taking opportunity forward. Thanks.
Hunger doesn't choose you. You don't choose it. It's a circumstance in life. It can happen to any of us.
Food insecurity exists in every county in the United States. The majority of the people that we serve are working families trying to provide the best food for their families as possible.
People really need help. The communities do the best they can, but anytime that an organization as big as Kroger can get involved, it just really makes a big difference for them.
The Free Store Food Bank's been partnering with Kroger since 1971 and are proud partners with them on Zero Hunger, Zero Waste.
In today's world, there's this fundamental absurdity, which is 1 in 8 people go to bed hungry every night.
That's what we want to start talking about, is how do we do a better job and deliver food to those who are hungry and struggling.
We need the awareness, right? 40% of the food produced in this country gets thrown away, which is just unfathomable when you think about it. And there's a lot of people out there that could use this food.
We're all in this together to make sure that we're salvaging as much as we can from our stores to feed people and keep food out of the landfill.
We are proud to have 200 food banks that serve every county of the United States.
It's very rewarding to help out and give back.
Feels really good. It's a humbling feeling.
It's just a matter of awareness and how we can maybe start to change how people perceive food. If it's bruised a little bit on the outside, it doesn't mean it's not great on the inside, right?
See somebody rescuing food and trying to give back to the community and helping feed the insecure is amazing.
Items that are ready to come off the shelf that are expiring are picked up by us, taken directly to a pantry, distributed that very day. They don't go to a landfill, so it's grocery rescue.
We also really try to get food that rounds out those meals.
We literally could not do it without all of our local partners, and Kroger's been a huge help in what they've given to us directly in the ways of like fresh produce or meat or bread items.
We're donating what we would serve our own families, and that's so important.
Kroger's initiative Zero Hunger, Zero Waste aligns with Feeding America's mission, which is to make sure that we feed people that are hungry today, but we also look at how to end hunger down the road.
We can make a huge difference and truly impact for the better. And it's going to change the way you think about a world where there's zero hunger and zero waste.
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you very much for your Zero Hunger, Zero Waste program. We're with you all the way on that. Okay, folks, now we're going to go to breakout sessions. We're just a couple minutes behind, but we're going to start these at 11:10, and I know that you can get there by 11:10. We've got plenty of people in the hallways to point you around the Reagan Building to your rooms. The sessions you can see on the screen behind me, and if you have any questions, of course, ask our staff. And also look for the little squares in the floor with arrows pointing where you ought to go. Thanks a lot.